Hello everyone. I'm using a handheld mic today, so this could be a little bit tricky, but thank you all for coming. We've got an interesting topic today on what is a photograph. It's a little bit different from our usual structure that we run here for the Thursday lunchtime seminar. So I hope you're as excited as I am to unpack what this question is and maybe work out an answer to it, but also maybe not. Before we get started though, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land at the moment. I'd acknowledge the Aboriginal elders past and present, and make note to that and make note to our presence on their land. So, what are we going to do today? We've got a panel discussion, and I have some lovely colleagues of mine here, friends even, you might call yourselves. And we're going to talk about what is a photograph. All of us are practicing photographic artists in different capacities, but I just want to sort of introduce everyone before we get started. So to my left, I have Mc Fetridge-Read. Christine is a New Zealand-born photographer and writer represented by M33 in Melbourne. She is influenced by Barth's evocation of, I didn't read these bios before I came up here, clearly, of a winter garden in Canberra the Cedar. The ideas of seeking out familiarity after a traumatic event and tensions between absence and presence are ongoing areas of research and interest in her work, particularly following her experience of the Christchurch earthquakes. She is currently an MFA candidate at RMIT University and a founding member of Women in Photography NZ and AU. Next to her, we have Teva. Teva Cosic is an artist and photographer currently completing her Bachelor of Arts at RMIT. She is taking time to experiment and expand her own practice and devotes some more time to learning during this period. Teva recently participated in CCP's Salon project, where the CCP have a salon every year where they hang a number of works that people submit to it. And Teva's been responding to weekly themes that the CCP has prompted her with. And she's currently showing work in the Alternative Photographic Processes exhibition that we have outside in the gallery. Then we have Bella, and Bella Capezio is an artist, photographer and lecturer. Her practice and research, where she's currently completing a PhD with RMIT, circulates around themes of religion, sanctity, queerness and landscape. After completing her BA in photography at RMIT, she went on to co-found and direct Ruffian Gallery from 2013 to 2015, home to socially aware photography in Melbourne's West that aim to help emerging artists and students exhibit their work. Her interest in modes of publication and the production of photo books has led to coordinate the Asia Pacific Photo Book Archive. She is excited about alternative forms of visual storytelling and probing photography's objective truths. Bella is the other teacher for the Alternative Photographic Processes course at RMIT, for which I also teach, if you didn't know. And then lastly, we have Jacob. I never know how to say Jacob's last name, but I think it's Jacob Raupach. Beautiful. He's an artist and publisher based in Melbourne, Victoria, currently an MFA candidate at University of Tasmania. Jacob's practice exists at the intersections of photographs, artist books, sculpture and installation. Through these mediums, he investigates the invisibility of labour, the relationship between natural and societal environments, and the ways in which art as a practice can help alter and rewrite our perceptions of place and history. His work has continuously tried to address these issues through the production of artefacts that deal with abstract forces like capitalism and climate change via a realist and documentary aesthetic. Whew. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So, today we sort of organised this talk to talk about this question, what is a photograph? And I find personally, as someone who still considers themselves to be a photographic artist but works less and less with something that you would call traditional photography, this is a question that I'm always trying to answer. And I'm always trying to link my practice, which is mostly installation, screen-based practice now, back to the photographic, because I have this sort of idea that I need to be a photographer, I think. It's an interesting question and not so much an easy one to answer. But I'm going to just talk a little bit, I suppose, about some of the things that I think about when I raise this question as an introduction to it. And then we're going to have a bit of a sort of informal discussion about some different things and look at some different practitioners who maybe sit on the edges of what would be considered photographic. The place I really like to start with this is simply the sort of definition of photography, or where this word comes from. So for those who don't know, photography comes from Greek roots. The roots, you sort of break the word in two. First word being photo, which is the word for light, and second word, graphy, which is the word for drawing. So we think of photography as drawing with light. And I find that this definition is really interesting to me because I find it's very ambiguous, and I like ambiguity when it comes to art, because it means that I can stretch the definitions of things in sort of ways that you wouldn't necessarily predict. So I think, one thing we're going to sort of talk about today is when the photograph starts and where it ends. Does the photograph start in the camera, or when a photograph is produced, or when it's printed? At what point can we consider it a photograph? But I find that this idea of drawing with light leaves a lot of room for interpretation within that spectrum. So for me, that is one of the interesting things that I consider when I'm making work. There are a couple of theorists too that I think of when I'm talking about photography, and that's Wilhelm Flusser and Rosalind Krauss, particularly two sort of texts that they've written. First one being Wilhelm Flusser's Towards a Philosophy on Photography, and Rosalind Krauss's Reinventing the Medium. And they sort of come from two different aspects, or two different approaches in my mind. And this is how I introduced this sort of idea of stretching the definition of photography to my students at RMIT. So Wilhelm Flusser talks about the camera being a black box in which some sort of magic happens in it that we don't necessarily need to define, but he's an advocate for automation. So he talks about these two things, the apparatus and the program. The apparatus being the camera, and the program being a game that the photographer plays in order to use that apparatus to capture images. And his sort of idea of photography is that the more automated the apparatus can be, the more creative space is left for the photographer in order to make work, whether that be perspective, exposure, all those sort of things. And I think this is sort of an old-fashioned view of photography, particularly in the age of Instagram, where we are so saturated by images. Because if anything, automation has made it so easy to take photographs that we're sort of left with this situation where no photographs are unique. And there are artists like Penelope Umbrico who deal with that. So through her Flickr images, Penelope Umbrico takes images from Flickr like sunsets, of which there are literally billions of photos on Flickr, maybe billions, and shows that, by sort of capturing these individual moments, we were sort of removing the importance of them in a lot of ways. Krauss, on the other hand, in her text Reinventing the Medium, talks about using the technical supports of a convention or a medium in order to create work. And she sort of refers to looking at the things that underlie the system and using them as a jumping board in order to make something. So rather than accepting automation, picking that automation apart and using those things in order to really respond to or to create work from. I definitely sit more with Krauss, and I think that a lot of contemporary practitioners sit in that realm as well. Currently in photography, we're seeing a lot of people use analog photographic mediums, looking at the materiality of those mediums in order to create work. But I'm also very interested in the digital end of that spectrum too, which is not sort of touched upon quite as much, at least not yet. But I think there's a very interesting field of artists who deal with digital materiality and look at these technical supports in which to make work, who I'll be talking about today. So I've got a couple of quotes here too, just to sort of start us off, which I quite like. The first one is from André Bazin, from his text, The Ontology of Photography, which is a very sort of beautiful text for those who haven't read it. And he talks a lot about sort of photography and its relationship to painting. And this was written quite a number of years ago when this idea was a little bit more fresh. But part of it says, the objective nature of photography confers on it a quality of credibility. He says, a drawing will never have the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. And this is, I think, a really nice way of talking about this idea of objectivity and subjectivity within the image, and this sort of boundary that photography sits on, where it is potentially objective and subjective at the same time, or maybe leans one way more or the other. I'm personally of the opinion that the photograph cannot be objective at all, at least in a sort of complete sense. But I'm curious to hear what my panelists think about that in just a second. Another quote I have here, which I really like too, is by Richard Avedon. So I'm sure a lot of you know Richard Avedon, documentary photographer, portrait photographer, did a lot of photographs of people in America, I think in the West. All photographs are accurate, but none of them is the truth. Another very interesting idea of this relationship between objectivity and subjectivity that the image seems to strive. So that's where we're going to sort of start things off with my first question. Is a photograph objective, or is it simply sort of perceived to be objective? And maybe if it's important to sort of distinguish between those two. Anyone want to kick it off?
So I was, this morning I was reminded of an essay that, to be closer. Oh my God, this is weird.
You're going to be right into it, yeah.
And just to kind of, the first quote, Bazin?
Bazin, yeah.
Where photography has a quality of credibility. I was rereading this essay I read a number of years ago. I've got some quotes here by Roger Scruton, written in 1981. It's called Photography and Representation, and he kind of argues against that. He says that when I appreciate a painting as representation, I see it as what it represents, but I do not take it for what it represents, nor do I necessarily believe that what is represented represented in the painting exists, nor if it does exist, that it has the appearance of the object that I see in the painting. So, I find that quite interesting because, in the way that we can manipulate photography now through software and through intention and things like that. I think there's an element of subjectivity that cannot be denied, and I'm not sure, I feel like I'm rambling now. Does anybody want to? Yeah.
I was just going to say, this is another field that interests me, this idea of image manipulation and the digital image. And there's a lot of, there's this point in photographic theory where we talk about the index. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with semiotics here, but there's a guy called Charles Peirce who defines semiotics, particularly in the realm of photography, as the icon, the index, and the symbol. The index is the thing that links the photograph to what was there before it, and it's what sort of creates this idea that we believe what we see in photographs. Uses some examples in the text, such as thunder. We hear thunder, you know there's been lightning, or when you see a footprint, you know that there's been a foot. So there's this sort of relationship between the two. And I find it's interesting when we start talking about digital manipulation, because the digital image in some ways it loses this connection, because a digital image boils down to binary data. Binary data are ones and zeros, and the only reason that we see a digital image as a photograph to sort of start with is because a program interprets that binary data in a way. One thing I might do while the next person is talking is show a different way of displaying that binary data by turning an image into a sound file. And so when the image becomes a sound file, does it stop being a photograph? It's still the same data, it's just being, interpreted in a different way.
Can I take off from it? Thanks. Okay, cool. So I think that what we also need to realize is that even if you are shooting film, you're usually using technological methods to scan it, and so it's already becoming the binary data that you're talking about. And I think that the objectivity argument, as you said before, it's like indexing something that might have happened, or indexing someone that might have existed, or being in a certain, in a certain scenario. And that's why I think that I'm really interested in CGI'd, when an apartment block is coming up and they're like, this is the future. we have decided that there's going to be like this person skateboarding over here and this pram over here, and none of it is real, but you know, it's like this imaginatory space that they've created to try and sell something, essentially. So I think that it's interesting that, you know, they were based off real incidences or real photos or real stock photos that were found, but they have been kind of collated together. They're a little skewish, they're a little out of scale, they're not quite right, but somehow, you know, somehow they're still trying to illustrate something of the future, I guess, and trying to sell us something. But I think that the objectivity argument is really bound up in like prioritization, trumping of the senses of sight a lot of the time as well, because I think that it can never be this real scenario, even though we kind of perceive it to be real, because we're kind of stuck on this idea that if you see something, you are experiencing it and you're understanding it in this certain way. And so I guess for me, it's like, I think it's interesting that photography that we believe, you know, as a fact, is never or often never referencing itself as a photograph or as a thing, you know. We cut out all the tripod stands, the shadows of the tripod stands. We cut, you know, out of selections, we cut out the one where your finger is just a little bit over that, the lens. And so, you know, we are trying not we, I mean, maybe you, but photographers are always trying to kind of fool someone into thinking that that is real a lot of the time. And I think that has kind of, that curtain has definitely come down, and not all photographers, let me just say, yeah, as well. So I think that it's interesting that you're playing this sound file, you know, because like if you run things through certain softwares, you know, what we expected is often like not what we're actually going to receive from the data. Yeah. Do you want to go?
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't want to play when you're trying to relax with a glass of wine at home. But this is what an image sounds like.
But also the sound changes depending on the picture as well.
That's right, yeah,
Yeah.
the file dictates.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
Cool, yeah. I shall. I think you've made some really good points, Bella. For me, I think coming back to that notion of like objectivity, photography, you know, in its invention was co-opted, you know, as this means of writing history and writing truth, and it became this kind of, it distilled down from one point perspective to become this thing, this apparatus that we used to see. And I think I really liked your point about how people are always trying to get rid of the tripod, get rid of the fingerprint, get rid of these actions that prove that there was a mediating device in between subject and operator. And I think that, to me, that's what's really, I think, important about photography at the moment, is that people are really critical, and people are very critical of the apparatus and are trying to manipulate and work around the camera as a tool, as a technology, and trying to figure out a way to kind of get it engaged as an object, as an apparatus in the practice of making photographs, rather than just assuming that the camera is this thing that we use to make photographs and not asking questions about why it represents how it does and why it makes things look how they do. And so I think we're at an exciting point where photography is being challenged as a medium, which, not to say that it hasn't ever been, but I think people are much more interested in questioning the image as a thing, and what it might be, and I guess that's why we're here, to figure that out. And so maybe I should try and tell you what I think a photograph is, but I'm not sure I'm at that point yet. But
that can be the finale.
Yeah, maybe we'll wait till the end. But I'm trying to think of a good jumping off point from that.
Well, I just want to also add that I think that it's interesting that photography is always trying to, like, it's a paranoid medium, in my opinion. Like, I think that we, you know, like you said before, it's coming up against all these other arguments, right? And painting, sculpture, like, they don't really, because the hand, you know, of the artist is present in most of those other mediums. I think that photography has a lot to answer, you know, has to answer a lot of questions, I think, about itself, and a lot of, like, that's why it becomes attacked. I feel like it's attacked a lot, and people who study photography, we're all very worried, it seems, you know, paranoid about not just the ethics of it, but like maybe how things are going to be interpreted, whereas like maybe a painting, a figurative painting, and an expressionist painting wouldn't really have to come under the same kind of scrutiny, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if I have much more to add. It kind of got me thinking a little bit about truth as well, and like, you know, I suppose we've kind of been conditioned to think of images that we see as real or false, and when you blur these lines of reality and what is real life and not real life, I think we get a little bit confused, and like photography, I guess, has a lot to answer for in that respect.
Yeah.
Where we're constantly manipulating images, we're being manipulated as well. And like, if you consider your Instagram feed, the algorithms they're creating for us to kind of box us into what we want to see, and it's like, it's kind of creating our small little universe of truth as well. And like, we're viewing these images over and over again. Yeah, and like, I guess back to subjectivity and objectivity, like what we see and what we think is truth and real or reality kind of comes down to what we've been conditioned to believe and what we perceive. I don't know, like, if that makes any sense. Kind of down to the root of what we think is truth and what we think is objective and subjective. Like, it will always change. And for me, like, I can think photography is completely subjective.
Yeah, I think for me that's the kind of the crux of photography, is that it's in itself it's a self-reinforcing medium, in that the act of making a photograph encourages you to continue thinking that that is a fact, it's truth, because you were there making it and it happened. And I think what you're getting at with Instagram is that it kind of works in that same way, where you see people post something and they continue to post a style of images, and it's like a self-reinforcing prophecy, where if you're posting these things that you want people to see about yourself as that one singular identity, it's kind of reinforcing that as fact. And so I think what's exciting about photography is just opening that up and going, well, that isn't the single self-reinforcing idea of an image. A photograph isn't one thing and it can't be contained. And so how do you get people to consider the image in a multiplicity of ways and not just that singular defining truth? And so I guess maybe that's a good question, is that what strategies do you think we can use? Because I think at the moment people are so ingrained with, I guess maybe overwhelmed with looking at images, that the important thing is teaching people how to actually read images and understand what they're saying, and be aware of that. And so maybe that's a good question, in that how do we get people to consider the photograph as not this static singular thing and open it up?
Yeah, I think that visual literacy is something that is not necessarily taught at school. Like, we learn how to read. You know, we learn how to read the symbols that are our language, but we don't really learn how to read the symbols that are being used for and against us, I guess. And just to add to that second point, you know, I think external context and like adds so much information, and also adds value to how we're looking at those images. So if you're looking at your Instagram feed at 4 a.m. alone at night in your bed, you're probably going to think that it's a bit more real than if you could turn to someone and have a discussion about it, you know? And so I think that there's something in that we have to stop. Maybe we have to keep talking about images, and not so much like how we take images, but maybe how we're seeing the image, you know, or how we're interpreting the image, instead of maybe just changing the conversations a little bit, I think is important.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if people have a level of visual literacy, but yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it is about coming around to having those conversations, and I feel like too we're being forced to have them as well as we kind of understand more about the way these platforms like Instagram and Facebook use our images and our data and that kind of thing too, which like takes another very scary turn. But yeah.
Yeah, great points, everyone. Yeah. No, well, I'm engaged with the content. I think visual literacy is an interesting thing, because I think in many ways we are more visually literate now than we ever have been, because we consume so many images. but it's a certain type of image that we're consuming, normally through forms of advertising or through the content that we see on social media, which is very far from the truth too. So I think, yeah, this idea of critically engaging maybe more in the images that we see rather than looking at them on face value would be something to be gained. And just like into response with your point, I suppose, Jacob, as to how we talk about this idea of getting around the photograph as perceived to be this sort of singular thing. I mean, personally, in my work, what I do is I've sort of given up the sort of aim of taking the photograph myself, and I've passed that along to the people in the gallery. So I create situations for them to take the photograph themselves, and the photograph becomes a sort of performative element of the work rather than the actual thing on the wall. And I find that very interesting too, because then that has all these other layers when that's shared on things like Instagram, and then it's sort of out of my control too. So in many ways, I'm giving that ownership onto the other person. And I know in your practice as well, the recent show you had at CCP, or maybe not so recent, where you had many images where there was sort of one image in focus, one out of focus, or from two slightly different perspectives. And I assume you were sort of tackling that sort of idea yourself in those works in some way. Yeah, that'd be correct? Yeah, cool. Great discussion, everyone. Let's go on to the next question, I suppose, and see how we go with that there. Where does a photograph start and where does it end? So this, to me, I raised this at the sort of start when I was doing the intro, this idea of drawing with light. Does the photograph start in the camera, outside of the camera? Is it an idea? Is it a physical thing? I think it can be many of these things and there's sort of overlaps, but I suppose you all sort of work in different ways. Like some of you make books, some of you make installations. We built a camera obscura here recently, and I think the camera obscura itself can be considered to be a photograph. It's just an ephemeral one. It sort of starts, it ends. There's this drawing with light that is projected, and then the thing disappears. Because I don't necessarily see the photograph as something that's static. I think in pretty much every sense, the photograph is always ephemeral at some level. Yeah.
Yes, even the flickering light on your LCD screen.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say one thing very quickly, and it's going to be about thinking about the photograph before the photograph before the photograph. And it's like, I think that what's interesting is that the photograph is enacted, I mean, it's performed, but also it's like we choose destinations. I'm not going to go on about travel photography, don't worry, but we choose destinations based on their photographability. Curators choose artists for, let's say, the biennial that happened due to the fact that it can be photographed, because if people who come to visit and they're photographing it are pasting it on their social medias, then it's more likely to be seen by more people. So I think that the photograph happens a lot earlier than we think it happens.
That's kind of interesting, I think, just in thinking about, particularly, I'll just single out the NGV here and their kind of suite of shows that have been going on for the last 6 months or so, it's probably longer, but I mean, even just talking about the Cause exhibition that's on at the moment, that's built as spectacle. It's built as an image-making machine. They want people to turn up to the show and take selfies and post them on Instagram and develop this free marketing through photography, because they know that people are going to want to make photographs of themselves in front of these objects. So it's kind of built in that we're being told to make photographs of ourselves, that they're kind of co-opting the language that we've built with smartphones. And so I guess maybe to pick up on some points that you made, Chris, I think I'd agree totally that the camera obscura is it's definitely a photograph, but what I always think is that photographs just have more or less photographness, I guess. Like a camera obscura has a certain amount of photographicness to it, in the same way that a piece of film has a certain amount of photographicness to it. And so neither a piece of film, a print on the wall, or a camera obscura is any more or less photographic, but they all just maybe share different elements of the notion of photography. I mean, these things that we've kind of built around the photograph to be a photograph, the things we've determined something to be a photograph. So they all pick up on certain bits of that. And that's just, part of that's embedded and part of that is just us responding to the medium as we move forward. And I think you're right in that, and particularly I guess with the exhibition that's on at the moment out there, is that there's this renewed interest in alternative processes like cyanotypes and lumen prints, and like you said, letting film or photographic paper just expose to the elements and removing the camera from the equation and I guess almost trying to distill photography down to what we think it should be, which I think is interesting. People have decided that the camera is irrelevant, it's not photographic, and people are just using sheets of film and sheets of paper to make an image or make a photograph, and have determined that there's enough photographicness in it to be termed as an image.
Yeah, and through doing that, you're then acknowledging. It's like self-referential or self-acknowledgement, in the sense that the photograph is acknowledging itself as a photograph, and I guess then it becomes like a bit meta-conceptual for, like people who are interested in art as pointing out its faults or its traits or its, I don't know, I guess like it's tropes even. Yeah.
Definitely, and I think, thanks for pulling this up, Chris, and maybe we'll pass, I know Christine's got some things to say about this, but this image by Justine Varga maybe encapsulates that really well, in that it's being critical of the idea of the portrait and the photograph. And just for background, this is a portrait by Justine Varga of her grandmother that was made in collaboration, and so it's, pen and pencil and dribble and heat and sweat and all these things that her grandmother has left on the photographic film. And so it's a collaboration, and I think that's what's really interesting about Justine's work, is that she's really asking, well, at what point does a photograph start or end, to come back to that first question, I guess, And yeah, I'll pass it to you, Christine, if you want to say something.
I mean, you did a really beautiful job of saying what the photograph's about, but what was interesting about this image, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it as well, is that it won the Olive Cotton Award, which is a portrait prize, and it was the fact that it won was incredibly divisive. So unlike the National Portrait Prize, which stipulates that an image must be of a person, the Olive Cotton Award doesn't do that. So I think that this fits in quite beautifully, and personally I really love it as well. I think the intention to work collaboratively with her grandmother and to use parts of her spit and her drawings and things like that to create an image is quite profound. But I know a lot of people would disagree with that as well. Does anybody want to add anything else?
I'll add something, yeah. So I think that, for me and for I think a lot of people who are up here, like the camera is like one element, and it's an important element sometimes when you're trying to picture something. And you want it to, be representative or visual, like you kind of saw it. But I think that for most of us, we can all agree that that's like barely the start, really, because there are so many ways that the image it passes through like a myriad of different kinds of softwares, programs. It can be printed in a lot of ways, and then and then we have again like all the external context that is added through its showing even. So I think that for me, and I think for you, would you say, is everyone in agreement that like taking the photo is just the start? And I think that recognizing yourself as a person and like what else you can kind of add to that, like breaks away from the technical restraints, I think, and this idea of objective technical truths as well. And if you give it enough time or like attention, sometimes you'll notice that mistakes happen, and if you're acute to those mistakes, they can actually be really great opportunities for you to have like a unique voice, and to kind of, I don't know, I guess, again, like maybe acknowledge yourself in the making more. And I think that that's kind of what helps separate you from the rest of the crowd with, the same camera as you, for example.
Actually, can I add to that?
Yeah.
as well? Something that I found as well in kind of thinking about what we might discuss today is that, like, I don't actually think all that much about what a photograph is in my practice. What I kind of tend to think about more, I think, is, who or what is a photographer, like how we make images, in terms of a conceptual kind of framework, and how we do that ethically as well. I don't know if other people kind of, just this, I don't feel like I'm disengaged from materiality, but because, I produce books and prints and things like that, but I wondered if any of you four felt the same way, like whether you tend to think, you think about materiality quite a lot, but whether the other things kind of, whether it's separate or whether they're sort of mutually exclusive. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. Materiality is always at the forefront of my mind with my practice. But one of the things that really drove the latest iteration of my work as far as making it interactive or reactive to the audience that was seeing it was this idea of, I wanted to create some work that could be approached by everyone. And I found that by taking images, where do you stop? Like, how do you get a broad range of subjects, whether it's sort of gender, race, sexuality? How can I capture a broad enough range of people to make that, all-encompassing? If I want to talk about things like identity or our relationship with digital media and that sort of thing. And my solution to that was just to not try. And I guess, there are still some sort of failures with that because the work largely depends on who visits the gallery space. But in a way, I am trying to, again, pass that along to the participants rather than trying to capture it myself. Does anyone have anything else to add, or should we?
No, let's move on.
All right, cool. So, I've got lots of other questions, but we're getting towards the end of the talk. There is sort of one more that I really wanted to talk about, though, which was to do with, digital media, because I think we've been talking a lot. We have talked about digital media, but I think we're in a really interesting space at the moment with photography. It comes to this idea of this question here. Where did I have it? Can a photograph be produced rather than reproduced? And I just wanted to talk about some new sort of forms of image making, which they look photographic, but might not necessarily photographs. And I'd be curious to hear what you guys have to say. The first one is something like this here. Has anyone seen this website before? This person does not exist or heard of it? Very interesting website, because what this is an artificially generated image. It's an image that actually starts from random noise, and a system looks at other images, learns from those images, and makes the noise slightly more refined until it looks like a person. And has this sort of system in place where the image tests, the system tests itself, and when it gets to a point where the system is fooled, that's when it becomes this photograph. But I think this is this is interesting because it's AI learning that's creating the image rather than, say, light or a camera that's creating it. Even though it's learning from those processes, they aren't necessarily involved in its creation. Another work that I wanted to mention too is this one here by Heather Dewey Hagborg. What she did was she went around and found things like cigarette butts, hair, all sorts of stuff on footpaths, put it through DNA testing, and then created these 3D models of the people whose DNA that she found. So again, it looks like a photograph, it looks like an image, but it's derived from data rather than light.
We'll never litter again.
Well, and I think this work I find is very interesting too, because DNA science isn't complete. It isn't necessarily just because you get a DNA reading, it's 100% accurate. There are sort of failures within that process. So these portraits could look exactly like the person who dropped the cigarette butt. They could also not look like them, or they might look a little bit like them. But for me, I find that sort of interesting to ponder. I think it'd be interesting walking into a gallery like this and seeing your face on the wall. But yeah, I guess we'll finish off sort of with a few more points, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as to whether you think that these are photographs, or if we've sort of transcended into some other realm now through AI or through data-created images.
That's a big question.
Controversial. I would say that these are not photographs, especially because they're 3D prints. They're made out of plastic, and I think that what philosophically is confusing us, especially about this work, is that we can see ourselves, and we're used to seeing ourselves through the reflection, right? Reflections in a mirror, reflections through light substrates in silver, halides or something. Like, we're used to seeing ourselves, the world, what we think is like, maybe not us necessarily, but what is us as like a human race or something. So I think that this is, to me, going more towards like a bit more maybe robotics or, hyper technology. But I just want to also create an argument. So.
Yeah, I agree, actually.
Oh.
Thankfully, right? No, but I think the interesting thing with AI is that people still have to set parameters for what it can and cannot do. Yeah, it gets to a point where it can learn by itself, but it's still learning within a framework that we've given it. So these things that are creating images are still learning from our definition of what an image is. So we're still telling it what a photograph is and then it goes, okay, this is how I'm going to make a photograph. Oh, it gets to a point where I can recognize that photograph looks like that photograph. But it's still learning from a photograph. So it's not really making anything new, it's just reinforcing what we think an image is. And so I think there's something...
But also, I think that you're also conflating image and photograph a lot.
Maybe, yeah.
Whereas like, this is an image, maybe it's not a photograph, right? It's like an image, it has image qualities, but maybe it's not the same.
Has some photographicness?
Yeah, but I think that you're right that it's learnt off other images that we have created, yeah. Or deemed as image, definitely. Yeah. Teva, arguments.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I don't have much to say about that.
I think they are photographs.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, it sort of bounces off your point, really. The fact that these systems they're learning from photographs, to me, is what makes them photographs themselves. There still is that connection. If they were completely generated from, if AI was smart enough just to create an image without this sort of comparison, or if we were creating these sort of three-dimensional images without having an image data bank, then yes, I think that argument would hold true. But because there is still that photographic link there, for me, is what makes it a photograph. And it also, I think, comes down back to, if we sort of want to tie this around to the start with the ontology of photography. I also believe, I've been talking a lot about materiality, but it is the belief that something is a photograph, I think, that's just as important. Particularly for something where, like DNA, which we put so much faith in, again, as another objective kind of measurement. If we believe that DNA to be true and believe that to be a precursor to an accurate photographic or an accurate image, then I would also say there's a connection that we could say that this can be believed to be a photograph as well. But we might end there, and I'm curious to know if there are any questions. So yeah.
I relate this to architecture, which has been a profession for 4,000 years or more, art similarly or longer. So photography is relatively recent, 200 years, whatever. So is it more that it's, or part of the issue is it's like a young child, a toddler trying to discover where it fits. So there's a lot of unknowns in development there, and one of the headwinds I see is the definitions of things are changing. So an architect, if you look at what an architect is, it's a person who designs buildings, clearly defined in any dictionary, and yet it's used in common language by journalists or whatever, the architect of the government's asylum scheme, when it's nothing to do with architecture is it's classically defined, and yet it's used in a context to add some, exotic coverage to a medium. So photography is also going to be facing those sort of challenges.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. A lot of the other mediums have had time to sort of work this out, and I think photography is still in its infancy. And I think in a lot of ways, the photographic community shoots itself in the foot sometimes and really limits the potential of photography. One frustration I really have with photographic competitions, for example, is that they often ask for two-dimensional printed works, which I think is a very old-fashioned way of displaying images now. We generally display images on screen, and I don't necessarily think the photograph is something that needs to be static either. You know, a video, for example, is just 30 photographs displayed in quick succession. And so I find it very frustrating, I suppose, with my practice when these competitions have these very sort of defined boundaries of where the photograph sits. For me, I find it a much more exciting space to be trying to stretch those definitions, and I would think that those sort of environments would be the best place to do it. I don't know, has anyone else got anything to add? Or?
I just wanted to make a quick point on that and then pass it to someone else. But I'd just like to follow on from that, and I think it plays out most obviously when people who are maybe working with a practice that is exhibition-based, and they go, I'm an artist and I'm a photographer. And it's because photography has always been uncomfortable with its place within the art world as a visual art, as a medium, and as this democratic commercial thing that goes out into the world and does other things in various other forms. And so for me, I always find that fascinating that people want to separate art and photography as if they're mutually exclusive or something, like they can't work together, and you can't be an artist using photography that maybe does something commercially or works in another field. And so I think that's part of photography, still trying to work out exactly what it is. And that's, I think for me, that's why I love photography as a medium, because it's so frustrating in its ability to be defined. It's always shifting and always changing, and that's what's really fascinating about it. And so maybe I'll just leave that point there for response.
Any other questions? Or, yeah?
Well, following on from that, do you see that it's actually going to merge with art in a sense of that it's why does it need to be clearly defined as something different to art?
I think that because it exists in science, it exists in health, it exists in like medicine, it exists in art, it exists in travel, it exists in marketing, it exists, like photography, and not just photographs, but also it exists in our everyday, and so I think that it needs to be continually defined within that big umbrella. Because, as you said before, it's only 200 years old. It's, in my opinion, really paranoid. So, there are lots of things that we kind of need to clarify for ourselves, but also with the knowledge that we're going to have to keep re-clarifying these things for ourselves and, keep changing the language around it, maybe. Yes, in order for us to kind of keep having discussions about not just what it was or what it should be or what it could be, but also what it means to us personally, I think, because it's just it is ingrained in so many of our everyday activities, yeah.
I understand, I think all of this discussion between it doesn't seem to make much difference, because if you look at historical photographers like Ansel Adams and Weston, they did just as much manipulation of their image as what's happening today. Mm-hmm. The only difference is they were restricted to black and white, they were restricted to burning and dodging and stuff like that, and sepia colouring. But it just means today, because of digital photography, you're just being able to do more of it. If you look at the international landscape competition, you look at their images that won this year, not one of them looks to me like a genuine photo, because all the colours are not real colours. You can see they've been manipulated to the nth degree to make them, there's no blues, there's no in the sky, there's no greens in the trees. They're all being manipulated to the nth degree.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there was nothing dead in it. I'm sure that there was no people in it. I'm sure that it looked like one-point perspective. I'm sure that it was a panorama.
Yeah. To me, the degree now is just that there is far more ability to manipulate. But the actual end, I think it's when you're taking a photo, it's what comes out of the camera is the photo. What ends up on the screen or on the wall is an image, no matter how it's being produced.
Okay, so you see it as like an objective, like when it becomes an object, then it is a photograph.
When you finally sit there and you say, okay, this is a finished image, that to me is an image, you know, or a finished photograph. That's an image. When you take it, it's a photograph because it's just capturing a set of, you can call it data if you're digital, or you can call it a slide. It's just capturing a set of data. When you create an image, you start manipulating it. That's when it changes to an image, and that then blurs truth. It means that that image doesn't necessarily, as soon as you start manipulating, whether you change the sharpness, whether you change the colour balance, it's no longer the original photo. It's now an image and it's untruth. It's not a truth.
I think
you can manipulate that in the camera before you your angle, which lens you choose, that sort of thing.
Of course, I would argue that there is no truth at all. Even like, I mean, my main line of work is artwork documentation, and one of the things I have to do is use a color checker chart so that my colors in the image are accurate to what they are in real life, and even that doesn't give me something which is complete accuracy. So I would say at no point in the photographic process is this truth ever realized, but we believe it to be true, and that's a different conversation, I think. And again, it goes back to the ontology of the image, where if we believe something, does that sort of fill in for whether there is this sort of material truth in the actual photograph itself. But anyway, we're sort of at 2 o'clock now, so I think we should wrap things up. But yeah, thank you for that stirring conversation. I tried to Google things while we were talking and never managed to find anything that I actually wanted to. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching me search on Google without any success. But yeah, if you have any more questions or want to continue this conversation, then feel free to come up and chat to us. We'll hang around for a little while and have a talk, and help me thank all the artists who are up on stage with me.